There are times in our history where stories that are today dismissed as fantasy, phantasms, and myth were believed as readily as gospel from the pulpit. In Victorian Britain, these stories were often strange, disturbing, and horrifying. What you are about to hear is a story that captured the minds and haunted the dreams of a nation. Welcome to Victorian Folklore. Throughout the 1800s, the people of London would be wary to watch the rooftops at night if they ever found themselves walking those dark, cold streets under the moonlit sky, for a devil stalked the rooftops and leapt between the chimney stacks of the capital, a devil with glowing eyes, clawed hands, and superhuman abilities. This terror would soon become known as Spring-Heeled Jack. There were many tales of this fiendish creature that haunted the nightmares of the city. He had been seen for almost 70 years before he vanished as quickly as he had first arrived. It was cold in February 1838, bitterly so, and most people were trying to find comfort and warmth in their homes on the night of the 19th, and Jane Alsop was no different. She was in her father's house when she heard a powerful knocking upon the door. She rose from her seat and headed to the entrance of her home. Opening the door, she found on the other side a man in a long, dark cloak. He said he was a constable, a police officer, someone Miss Alsop could trust, and he asked her to bring a light, for he and his comrades had captured the terror of London, Spring-Heeled Jack himself, in the lane just outside her home. Struck by fear, and perhaps a little of the morbid curiosity common to the Victorians, Miss Alsop moved to comply with the police officer's orders. She found and brought a candle for the officer, clutching it in its metal holder. Her knuckles were as white as the winter snows that were only just beginning to melt. Walking out into the lane as she approached the officer and prepared to hand over the candle, something felt very, very wrong. He seemed to be alone, with no fellow officers or their captive to be seen. Gnawing fear bit into her guts. The officer began to grin, showing a fanged maw. He threw off his cloak, his eyes burning like fire. With a cackle, he spat blue and white flame from his mouth. The terror of London had come to Jane Alsop's door. Jane dropped the candle and tried to retreat, but without a word, Jack grabbed her with fierce metallic claws and began to tear at her gown. She struggled and thrashed, managing to tear herself free and scream for help. She fled back toward her house, but just as she reached the steps of her home, Jack caught her again, slashing at her neck and arms. But before the attack could continue and before Miss Alsop could sustain any further harm, her sister arrived, and the terror of London fled into the night, leaping away into the darkness. His horrifying laughter and his fire-breathing powers would haunt Jane Alsop for the rest of her life. 8 days later, on another freezing cold night, Jack would strike again. Another young woman, Lucy Scales, would be his victim. She was walking home with her sister. They had visited their brother that night. He was not a man of great wealth. He was a butcher, making enough to live in a well-respected area of Limehouse, however. As the Scales sisters walked together, they passed by the Green Dragon Alley and noticed a tall, thin figure standing in the opening of the passage. Lucy was walking ahead of her sister, and as she approached the figure, he flashed a fanged grin at her and let out a gout of blue flame from his mouth before leaping up to the rooftops and escaping. Lucy was so overcome with terror, she collapsed to the ground in a seizure. Her sister tried desperately to support her, and a short while later their brother came rushing to their aid, following their screams. Neither of them saw Jack again. Both Miss Alsop and Miss Scales would recover from their encounters with Spring-Heeled Jack in time, though Miss Alsop was left with scars, and Lucy Scales would find herself consumed by fits of fear and delusion for years to come. The police set out to find the culprits of these attacks and arrested many, but they all turned out to be little more than drunken boasters. None would ever display the superhuman abilities described by Jack's victims. Over time, the stories began to fade, even as Jack was reported in cities other than London. And by the turn of the century, as the Victorian era ended, so too did stories of Jack. But perhaps that wasn't the end of the terror of London. If you are ever walking through a city at night, dear listener, and hear cackling from a rooftop, perhaps you should look up and catch a glimpse of the terror that haunted the nightmares of a nation.